The presidency is considered one of the most important jobs in the world, and as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. But where's the line? How much power is too much power? In this episode, we look at presidents past and present to figure out, are they really above the law? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. To help me answer this question, who else but Dr. Emma Long, Associate Professor of American History and Politics and Head of the Department of American Studies at the University of East Anglia. I can almost do that in one breath now. Welcome back, Emma.
Thanks, Liam. Good to see you.
Yeah, great to have you back on. So let's just kick off because obviously it's quite a topical subject for us to be discussing at this point in 2023. So let's just look at the big orange elephant in the room. What on earth is going on with Trump at the moment, and what does this tell us about the presidency generally?
Like many things with Trump, it's hard to know how much it tells us generally because he's such an unusual character in so many ways. I think we've talked about this before. I mean, as we are recording this in middle of October 2023, right? Trump is on trial. It's a civil trial, so there's no chance of jail or criminal penalties. But it's a trial that claims, or where he and his businesses and two of his sons are accused of inflating the wealth that they owned in terms of properties and so on in order to borrow more from banks at better rates and so on. I mean, in a weird kind of way, it's the first one, but it's the least significant of the ones that he's facing. You can break it down really. He's facing more or almost 100 criminal charges, right? If you add them all up, which is staggering when you think about it. But they break down effectively into four particular areas. Some I think are probably more significant than others and could potentially be more impactful than others. I think the two really big ones, the charges about surrounding the conversation he had with the leading official in Georgia about the 2020 election, where you hear the quote about finding 11,780 votes, I think it was. Questions about, was that interference with the election? Is it trying to interfere or undermine the elected and appointed officials who were managing the election? That's potentially really serious and goes to the heart really of a sense of American democracy. The other one regarding the 2020 election are the charges that come over the January 6th, 2021 Capitol riot, and the question about how far Trump is to blame for the violence that happened afterwards, how much that speech that he gave on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., can be considered an incitement to the actions that went on. Those who charged him with that obviously think that they can make a case for incitement. Obviously, his defense has been, I went and talked to people. What they did afterwards is nothing to do with me. But there are some really quite significant charges around that. There's the one where there's been something of a parallel with the Biden administration, which is the question about classified documents that were found outside the White House.
Yeah.
So there was those quite startling images of the FBI parked outside Trump's Mar-a-Lago home because he'd been refusing to cooperate with the Justice Department and handing over the documents and wouldn't admit that he'd got some of them. So they basically turned up and searched and took them. Um,
And the images of like all the boxes stacked up
yeah.
in Mar-a-Lago and just like publicly accessible places that allegedly contain classified documents. If true, that's shocking.
Yeah, and there's that famous photo, right, of them stacked up in the bathroom. Obviously not everything in those boxes was classified or top secret, think we're looking at somewhere, I think the figures are somewhere around about 100 documents, something like that.
Mm.
But clearly documents that shouldn't have been taken outside the White House by law to maintain sort of the accuracy of the record as well as security issues. So there's that one. And then there's sort of the rolling case around the payment of money to Stormy Daniels, who claims that she had an affair with Trump, and the shenanigans around the payment of money to her and who paid and where the money came. And the charge there is not the payment of money to pay her to keep quiet, which is legal under American law. It's the question of whether that money can be classed as helping the presidential campaign that was going on in 2016. And if it is, that money legally had to be declared as part of campaign funds, and it wasn't. So it's not the payment of the money, it's how far it's considered part of the campaign itself. So
Mm.
all of those things. And they're all scheduled. Well, three of the four are scheduled for trials next year. Trump is going to be very busy doing those and running for president at the same time. And the Georgia election one doesn't have a trial date yet.
Mm.
So these, and some of the charges are things where there might be a fine. Some of them are charges where the maximum prison sentence is 10 to 20 years. And
So
he's got
they're serious things then.
they're really serious. And I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about, if he was found guilty and if it was a custodial prison sentence, how do you actually practically lock up a former president with all the
Mm.
security issues that come with that? And for some of the lesser charges, should we say, there's been speculation that because of that, if he was found guilty, we'd be looking probably at fines rather than anything else. But there are some big charges here, especially around the legitimacy of the 2020 election. That if Trump was found guilty on those charges by a jury, it would be very hard, I think, to not impose some kind of custodial sentence. Otherwise, it might imply that just because he was a former president, just because of the practical issues, that he wouldn't get the same kind of sentence that somebody else might get if they'd been found guilty of the same thing. And that goes against the whole American system, which ultimately is based on the idea of rule of law, right? It's a rule of law system where everybody, from the president on down, everybody is bound by the same laws of the system. Now, we can talk about how far some people get hit harder than others by the legal system in the United States. There's a whole series of podcasts in that, right? But at the same time, there is this principle, and he's a very high profile example of that. So if he's treated differently because of who he is, then that runs a risk of undermining the entire system.
Yeah, and I guess there's definitely a discussion there, maybe in a future episode, about how Trump will use the court trials as a campaign platform, because knowing Trump, he absolutely will do that. But there are definite questions around, if we assume for the case of this discussion that he has done the things that he's been charged with, there's questions around whether or not he should have the autonomy to do those things. Should a president have a certain degree of immunity from the law that enables them to do their job in the best way possible?
Yeah, and I mean, the role of president's not easy, right? When you think about whether you like a person who's in the White House or not at any particular moment in time, they are the person. It's the buck stops here, right?
Mm.
Ultimately, they are the one responsible for making all kinds of really important decisions, some of which I suspect we never know about, because they're things about national security that it's decided that we shouldn't know
Mm.
about, unless we absolutely have to. So there has historically always been a sense that in some areas a president needs leeway when he or she is doing their official duty, right, in regards to the job. But in ultimately what we're talking about in regards to all of these cases, perhaps with the exception of the one of the documents, the classified documents found outside of the White House, all these others are not strictly sort of the presidential role, right? These are Trump's speech at the White House. Yes, he was president, but it wasn't specifically a presidential speech.
Mhm.
He wasn't acting as head of state, he wasn't acting as head of government. He was
Yeah,
there sort of as an individual, there to say, that he thought that, to support the people who were there at the rally, and whatever else happened. So I think
yeah,
you have to divide things up between things that people do within the confines of the role that they have, and things that they're doing tangentially to that. Now, I'm not saying that line's easy to draw, or that I would want to be the person who's drawing it, but there is a difference
mm,
between those things. And the law in the US, and I think here as well in Parliament, recognizes that. So, for example, if a member of Congress or a senator says something as part of their official role on the floor of the House or the Senate, there are fewer consequences should they say something completely outrageous or outlandish, if they're doing it in their formal role as part of that role, than if they're doing it as a private citizen outside of that. So
yeah.
there is a recognition of those differences, and I think that's important.
As we're learning at the moment from the fallout of the McCarthy ousting, you're never immune from the backlash of your own party, right?
No, exactly, and in fact, sometimes your own party can be you can be just as problematic, particularly with American parties where they're so big and so broad that there are factions within them. The Democrats have this too. It's just that they've been a lot quieter
Mm,
in recent years. I mean, Biden and even Obama to some extent ran into trouble with sort of the left wing of the Democratic Party, who at times have felt like they have not pushed far enough with policy. So yeah, and we're seeing, yes, the battle over speaker again as we record this. I mean, McCarthy had a battle to get the speaker role back in January this year as it was, so it's not entirely surprising there's been that internal revolt, I suppose.
yeah.
But yeah, just because we're seeing it on the Republican side at the moment doesn't mean that it doesn't exist on the other side as well.
Of course, yeah. And by the time this podcast goes out, McCarthy may even be back as speaker. Who knows? But anyway, I think one issue where there are very clear, very hard lines drawn between both parties is impeachment, and that tends to be an issue that will always divide. And in almost all cases, Republicans will support Republicans, Democrats will support Democrats, but it's still happened to Trump. There's obviously impeachment has been a buzzword the last couple of years. So what exactly is that legal process, and why does nothing ever seem to happen at the end of it?
um, I mean, things do happen at the end of it. It's just that when we've seen impeachment of presidents,
Mm,
it's that the politics have come into to play, I think is important. So impeachment is when a legislature or other public body that's constituted with the power for that holds or finds that there is sufficient evidence to hold another public official to account for misconduct. So it's important to remember that impeachment isn't doesn't necessarily involve criminal behavior, but it can, depending on the nature of what that official misconduct is defined to be in a particular set of circumstances.
mm,
Yes, it's come to be, certainly with even with Clinton when he was impeached in the 1990s, we saw that politics came to play a role in that too, although it was far more divided over the Trump impeachments and the attempts to, or the hearings that we've recently seen by Republicans in the House on impeachment for Biden.
mhm,
But I think there's also, it's worth remembering there are two stages to impeachment. So you can be impeached that's the first stage. That doesn't necessarily mean you're guilty. It's kind of like the equivalent of an indictment or being charged.
Mm.
In the US, it happens in the House of Representatives, and it's a judgment that there is sufficient evidence based on whatever investigation has gone on, that there's sufficient evidence to suggest that the official, can be charged with whatever misconduct the articles of impeachment try. So that's the first stage. And then the second stage is the trial. So we saw it with Clinton, we saw it with Trump recently. That happens in the Senate. It's presided over by the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and that is in many ways similar, in some ways different to a trial that we're perhaps more familiar with, where evidence is presented from both sides, and the Senate is the jury
Mm.
in that case. When in Clinton's impeachment in the 90s, once the evidence had been set out, it became really clear that the reason that Republicans were following it up were political ones. They didn't like Clinton as a Democrat, that this wasn't official misconduct. You couldn't talk for a long time about Clinton's personal behavior, but it was personal rather than to do with his role. And that sort of, when you followed the coverage of that became really clear. And there were some Republicans who voted to find him not guilty, in part as a result of that.
Mm.
What we saw with both Trump impeachments is what we've talked about before in other episodes, and what's really clear in American politics at the moment, which is that partisanship just played such a role in it, partly driven by Trump himself and his closest allies, who right from the start made the case publicly that this was a political agenda, right? That he hadn't actually done anything wrong, that this was just Democrats trying to get him out of office. Now, in all fairness, there had been some Democrats who had said, we want to impeach him to get him out of office. So they kind of made for a rod for their own back at that point. I don't think it's the only reason that they pursued it, maybe not even the main one. But once that idea was out there, Trump and his allies just made hay with that to bring together his supporters,
Mm.
and we saw that in both. And the second one, the second impeachment happened after the election, and there were a lot of quite legitimate questions, I think, there about whether you can actually impeach somebody who isn't now president because they lost the election. Um, but again, we saw politics play a role. So it's still an important power. And actually, if you look at impeachment over American history, that it's not happened a lot, but it's not just presidents who are subject to it. It's any federal government official. So it's been used most often actually against federal judges. And 8 federal judges have been removed from office through impeachment. So they've been found guilty
Mm.
in that trial. 4 others were found not guilty. So it's not that impeachment always ends in failure. It's just that when you're using it on for the president of the United States, that comes freighted, right, with a
Yeah.
whole load of issues around the person, and the role, and the
Yeah.
way Americans like to think about the person who holds that role at any particular moment in time.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like we've ever really come close to seeing a president removed from office, except, of course, Nixon. And I think we can argue whether or not that he would have been removed from office. I think there certainly seems to be a lot of confidence that he would have been, but of course he resigned before that happened. It does bring into question just the how effective the impeachment process is, and then when we start to see the attempts to impeach Biden as well, is it just becoming a political tool, and is the whole process of impeachment against the president just getting a little bit diminished now?
There's a risk. There's a real risk of that. I mean, when I first started studying US politics, it was before Clinton was impeached. And we were like impeachment's something that's never, hasn't been used since the 19th century against an official. So things have changed in the last 25 years or so. And you know the question of where blame lies is a complicated one, from that, but we are seeing a kind of tit for tat response here. So particularly with Trump, I mean the impeachments of the Biden impeachments, the attempt, the hearings. I think there have been two previous sets of articles of impeachment as well since this Congress came into effect. This is Republicans trying to get their own back,
Mm,
to make a point, so saying we think what you did is political, so now we've got control of the House. We're going to do the same thing.
yeah.
Are there questions about Hunter Biden, Biden's son, which seems to be where the focus of things is at the moment? It seems like there probably are, yes, but there's also a question about the separation between Biden's son and Biden himself.
Mm.
Again, the details of this are sort of hazy, but yeah, I think what we're seeing in the last 5-6 years maybe is risking undermining impeachment as a power, that
Yeah.
it's coming to be used as a political tool.
There's been many cases over the years, even within our lifetimes, where presidents have been somewhat flexible with their interpretation of the law and what they are and aren't allowed to do. Why don't there ever seem to be repercussions? Because impeachment is one thing, but they could still be held accountable for those actions. Why aren't they?
Oh, there's a big question. I suppose some of it comes down to what we were talking about before, right? About the fact that the job of a president is difficult and they have difficult decisions to make, often in situations that require very quick responses, or if not quick responses, then responses where there isn't an obvious answer. I think,
Mm,
and I don't mean this as a way to justify decisions made by presidents, but I do think that as a historian, part of my training is to think about it in the context rather than necessarily with hindsight. Sometimes presidents have to make decisions based on partial information. Sometimes they have to make them really quickly because it's an emergency situation. And sometimes I think second guessing that afterwards is right as a learning exercise, but not necessarily right as a punitive one, if that makes any sense.
mm,
Um, but there are people who would disagree with me, and of course there are times where questionable behavior is not doesn't fall into that context. So you mentioned Nixon, for example. He's a really good example of this. The Watergate affair, the bugging of Democratic National Headquarters to spy on their opponents in the election, the ransacking of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try and turn up dirt on him because of the leak of the Pentagon papers. Those weren't emergency decisions on behalf of the nation, right? That was self-interest at best. Um, and those were calculated decisions that took place repeatedly over a period of time. So there's a good example of there not being repercussions. And Nixon resigned, so we won't know, because impeachment obviously can only happen to a sitting official.
mm,
Should there have been criminal charges? I think a lot of people feel like there absolutely should have been. There weren't, because President Gerald Ford, who had been Nixon's vice president, notably the only president never elected to either office, because he became vice president when Nixon's first vice president resigned over a scandal. So Ford was appointed, and then of course Nixon resigned, so Ford became president. One of his very early actions, even as the full scope of Watergate was still being uncovered through trials and through the press, was to pardon Nixon for any crimes that he may have committed. And that was hugely controversial. In fact, many people think that Ford lost the 76 election in part because of backlash over that decision. But he was quite open both then and subsequently about his reasons for doing it. His argument was, if he didn't pardon Nixon and he had there were trials and investigations and so on, a bit like we've been seeing with Trump actually,
Mm.
although the circumstances are slightly different. But if that had continued, Watergate up to that point had been so damaging to the nation that it would continue to damage the nation in unforeseen ways. So his understanding of it was to draw a line, was to pardon Nixon, draw a line under it, and try and get the country to move on. Again, there are plenty of chances to second guess that decision, but those were his reasons for doing it.
But does that not undermine the whole democratic process? And it sets a dangerous precedent that presidents won't be held accountable for their actions, that they can get away with these things. You know, it just, I understand the logic behind not wanting to have everything linger, but at the end of the day, if he's acted illegally, should he not be punished in the same way that anyone else doing that should be?
Yep, goes back to the point we were making before, right? About does somebody get away with it just because they happen to hold the highest office in the land, or maybe some of the other high offices, if we were talking about situations regarding other officials.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't know that there's an easy answer to that particular question. And yes, you're absolutely right that if you point to Ford's precedent, even if Trump were to be found guilty on some of these charges, a sympathetic president could pardon him for that. Of course, he has made suggestions that if he's found guilty and he wins the election anyway, he could pardon himself. Yeah, I don't know that legal scholars have looked into that one too deeply, but I suppose it's technically possible.
It
But
won't
yeah,
stop him trying, will it?
probably
You know,
not. No, no. Based on past experience.
yeah. I think there's also a question here of, we can argue till the cows come home about whether or not presidents should be punished the same as anyone else by the law. But I think there's another element here that regardless of how accountable they're held legally, they're still held accountable in the eyes of the public. And I think that the legacy and the reputation that succeeds their presidency is still a really important thing. And I guess some people might argue that that's the real kind of judgment of their term in office, regardless of what's done sort of legally against them.
Yeah, and I guess it's something that doesn't affect ordinary people,
Mm,
right? If they've committed a crime, or if they're charged with committed a crime, they're not necessarily thinking about their wider legacy in a way
mm,
that we would expect a president to be doing. So yes, is it the same? No, clearly it's not. Does it, Nixon's reputation for all the good things he did as president, and I'm not a huge fan of Nixon, but he had some really significant achievements as president that are overshadowed by the discussion of Watergate, and probably rightly given the scale of that. And Clinton, to some extent, I guess that the impeachment and the discussion over that is part of his story. It's not dominated in the way that it did with Nixon, I guess partly because it didn't end Clinton's presidency. It
mhm.
didn't end his political career. Um, but we saw it come back a little bit when Hillary Clinton was running for president, even though arguably it was nothing to do with her. um we so those things are there, and they do come out. And we see it with George W. Bush. So there was a recent poll by the Pew Research Center that asked people to rank their top presidents of the last 40 years. And for Democrats, they listed Obama quite clearly
Mm.
first. For Republicans, it was Reagan and Trump, which perhaps is unsurprising in many ways. But one of the really interesting things was that George W. Bush, his approval ratings for a large part of his presidency, particularly through the aftermath of the 9/11 2001 terrorist attacks, and even through the early years of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, despite the fact that that was controversial internationally and nationally, through those early years, the public got behind a wartime president. His public opinion polls were surprisingly high, and yet in this poll, he ranked something. I think he got like 7% of the vote in this poll, and I think some of that is the longer term legacy of the war in Iraq and the
Yeah.
questions about the behavior of the United States and American troops, and the legality of some of that. The debates about weapons of mass destruction and so on. So there is a longer legacy of these questions, especially if people feel like those questions haven't been resolved
Mm.
properly. So yeah, somebody runs for presidential office to do the job, certainly, but certainly also with one eye on their legacy. And if their legacy is tarnished by these kinds of things, then that's a hit to one of the things that they were looking for.
Yeah, yeah. And just to bring a close to this episode, because it's been a bit of a heavy chat, if hypothetically, and I know it's completely impossible, if you were president of the US,
Oh no, I don't know why anyone would want the job, to be perfectly honest.
well, no, it's a hard pass from me. But if you ended up somehow as president, what law would you be most likely to break and why?
Oh no, I was brought up to no, to abide by the laws, and unless they were unjust laws. Thinking about someone like Martin Luther King's argument that the only just thing to do about an unjust law is to break it. I don't know. I think I just think that, to go back to an earlier point, if I was going to be in that position, it would probably be because I'd made a decision in a really high pressured situation, and maybe made the wrong one.
Hmm.
But which is edging around your question, which is to say, the idea of breaking the law makes me feel really uncomfortable, even hypothetically.
This episode of America, a History podcast, was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A special thanks to my guest this week, Dr. Emma Long, as always. And if you like what you heard in the podcast, do check out some of the additional resources that we've popped in the show notes. And as always, a lot of work goes into the making of this podcast. So if you can leave us a review and a rating, or tell your friends, or share it wherever, that'd be awesome. And if you want to get in touch with the show, connect with us on X, formerly Twitter, if you still use that, over at American Studies, or contact me directly at This Is The Hef. Alternatively, you can find me on LinkedIn at Liam Heffernan, or find Podcasts by Liam as well. Or just drop me an email, hello@podcastsbyliam.com.